This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 214 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast, and it's a very special episode. It's an interview with travel writer Paul Theroux. I was really excited to have the chance to interview Paul. As you'll hear soon in my fangirly first question, he really has had a huge influence on my life. I was thinking and kind of tracing back my travel history. It's all a few decades back, so it's a bit fuzzy, but I know that Paul's book, The Great Railway Bazaar, somehow came into my possession in the 90s, so I was in my final years at high school. I suspect I bought it secondhand at the annual Save the Children book sale. I used to go every year and come home with a huge box filled right to the brim of new-to-me books. And I think The Great Railway Bazaar probably really struck a chord for me right away. I was really interested in European history. I'd just been in Germany, in Berlin, for German reunification. I was studying a lot of world history in year 11 and 12. Unfortunately, we didn't look at Australian history much, so it was very much Europe and Asia. And I was keen on train rides. I'd had some amazing train rides in Germany on that trip in 1990. My mum was obsessed with Russia and studying Russian language, so the Trans-Siberian part really appealed to me. And I kind of really fixated on one day riding that train. A decade or so later, I finally did. So that was pretty cool. Over the following decades, I read many of Paul Theroux's travel books. I always have dipped back into the happy isles of Oceania. His explanation of a kayak trip, including Australia, and any of his books where he took trains, like Riding the Iron Rooster, which is through China, and more recently when he wrote Ghost Train to the Eastern Star, where he retraces, where possible, he retraces the Great Railway Bazaar route he took. So anyway, I am sure my travelling and writing life would be totally different if Paul Theroux had not published all these books, so how amazing to have the chance to chat with him. We spoke for well over an hour, and there's just so much that interested me, I couldn't really bear to cut it down. So I'm going to release this episode in two parts. So this week's episode includes us chatting about how to be a thoughtful traveller, the importance of speaking the language when you can, the impact of the internet and connectivity in the world today, and how that's kind of changed travel, and how internet research can be both good and bad. We talk about getting to know local people, which is, a really important part of travel for me, and he certainly had some different ways which were really intriguing. And we also talked about something that's really special for me, how being a teacher when you are travelling or living abroad as a teacher is just a great way to get to know local people and culture. So enough of me. Let's get on with my chat with Paul Theroux, starting off with my embarrassingly fangirly chat about how much his writing impacted my life. I have to say, thank you. You influenced me and probably my whole life by writing The Great Railway Bazaar. I read it as a teenager, and I became obsessed with train travel, and ended up going on the Trans-Siberian in my 20s purely from reading your book. And there's not many people that I can say that about. So thank you. I think you really had a big impact on my life, because I've traveled a lot, lived abroad in many places, and I think my life would be very different if I hadn't caught that travel bug. So
good. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah,
it's nice to know that. Well, there's two things I like about that. One is inspiring people to travel. The other is a teenager reading a book. The idea that young people are reading my work is something that is very pleasing to me, because I like to think that I'm either reaching a new generation, or that I'm not only talking to my own generation of very old people and who are sitting in easy chairs. I like to think that I might be speaking to someone who's going to get out there and do something the sort of thing that I was doing myself.
Yeah, well, I cannot count myself as being anywhere near as adventurous as you, but I hope that I emulate some of the attitudes to travel at least. So that I guess that's my first question. So on my podcast, we talk a lot about being a thoughtful traveller, and I wonder if I ask you, what do you think it means to be a thoughtful traveller? What do you think that might include?
I would say the first thing is you have to remind yourself of who you are, how small you are, and how unimportant you are, and that you're in a place and that you're a stranger. That you really have no right to. You have no power. And that you need to negotiate for everything that you have. You can't take anything for granted. I would say the most thoughtful traveler is the one who realizes that he or she is very small. There's a nice image by the poet Ferdowsi, who lived about 1,500 years ago, give or take. And he said, "We are but dust in the lion's paw." That's who we are as people. That's actually the title of a book too, Dust in Lion's Paw, by a great traveler. And I think if you remind yourself that's who you are, that you need to be watchful, you need to learn a language, you can't expect people to speak your language, to agree with you, and that you need to be as humble as possible. So I started my traveling in Africa as a teacher. So it wasn't travel, it was sort of residence in Central Africa in 1963, which now not only seems a long time ago, it was a long time ago. It was more than 50 years ago. So it was still a British colony, and there was, it was segregated clubs, and it was called Nyasaland. And I was a teacher. But the best thing I did was I learned the language. I learned to speak the language called Chichewa. So I could speak it. I can still speak it because I learned it so early. It's still in a cassette in my head.
Brilliant.
And that's something that a lot of the British people there did not speak the language. And so because I spoke the language, it was quite a lot of trouble to learn, but I was in a program that taught the language before I left. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And because I spoke the language, it wasn't just that I was an American or that I was young or that I was a white person. It was the fact that I could actually speak to people in their own language. And they said things to me that they had never said to anybody else. And I remember how angry there were workers around the school, cooks, gardeners, and whatnot, and they would say to me, and they had meetings, and they were very agitated about British occupation, and they told me how humiliated they were and why the British people in charge here. I remember one in particular. He was a real firebrand. He was like a character in a Melville story, Benito Cereno. He was very quiet when he was a cook. He was the cook of a Scottish teacher. And he used to bring the marmalade, and I'd see him, and he was there, yes, buona, no buona. But later, he was really, really angry and, revolutionary, and he used to agitate the other African workers and so forth. But anyway, he was ranting to me, but in a friendly way. He was saying, why don't these people understand, and this sort of in his own language.
Yeah.
And actually, it
so
wasn't
you got
his thing.
that
It was a
privilege of that because you had taken that effort to learn the language. So you were then had that privilege to be able to get that extra side of it that the perhaps other expats didn't get.
Yes, and it takes a lot of work, and I think quite a lot of belief to learn a language. It's not difficult. It doesn't take brains to learn a language, but it takes application.
Yeah.
Learning a language is children learn a language. Even not very bright children learn languages. Not very bright people learn languages. It's an activity. It's like learning to bounce a ball. Play a game. So anyway, so I would say that's the first thing, which is, I suppose, be humble, realize that you're small, that you're dust in the lion's paw, that you're disposable, that you're at risk, you're alone, you can be taken advantage of. and that you need to meet people on their own terms, that you are not, you can't come and say, I'm an American, look what we've given you. That's a lot of, not only Americans, but others.
Absolutely, not just Americans.
Say,
a lot of privileged Western travelers I've seen act that way, for sure.
They say they want like a personal reward for government funding. They say, we've given you this dam, we've given you this railway, whatever it is. So
yeah.
But it's a different world now. It's a connected world. So I would say one of the things that you're dealing with, well, here you are. You're in Perth, Australia. I'm in Sandwich, Massachusetts. We're speaking and looking at each other. When I first started to travel, I used to write postcards and letters. In fact, I didn't really get connected to the internet until the early 90s, and the internet was, I guess, later than that. And I still write in longhand. I mean, here's my high tech. I write with a pen.
Me too. My notes here, yeah.
So, but now we're in a connected world. A connected world can give you ideas beyond yourself and make you think that because you're connected, you're safe, and you can talk to anyone, go anywhere, find out anything. I think the understanding that travel is a laborious business, and that you need to do it slowly and with understanding. You can't just look at a Google map or Wikipedia or find out information that way. You need to find out firsthand what things are. And you find out that by watching, by listening, not by being big and bossy. So those are kind of simple, but I think important lessons. I also think this is also applied to the connection thing, which is it's very important to leave home. I mean, to completely leave home and not depend on your connection to home, of calling home, emailing, and so forth. I know people do it, and even I do it. I call my wife, I email, and so forth. But it's better. The more disconnected you are from home in life, as well as travel, the better off you are. I mean, when you're making your own decisions, and you're not referring to people at home or looking for a support system.
Yeah, you are truly making your independent decisions. It's really interesting you discuss this. So when I first travelled without my parents, I was 14 and I was travelling on a school trip, but we spent a month in Germany. And so it was 1990 and there was no internet, of course. And yes, we had a teacher there with us, but we were sent off to our different host families and we had no contact at all with our parents for the full month we were away. And now that I have a 10-year-old, I think, how did my parents survive this? But it was the making of me to be, relatively independent at that age and to be in a foreign country, to be trying to speak the language. And then later on in the early 2000s, I lived in Japan. I didn't have any access to email except once a week at an internet cafe. And I would travel and backpack and just turn up somewhere, maybe with my guidebook and just find a place by walking down the street. And nowadays, that just doesn't seem to happen, or you have to really force yourself to do that because the internet and smartphones makes all of this so simple. Why wouldn't you have looked things up before you got there? But I really miss kind of what you're describing. You've traveled in that way a lot more than me, but I really miss that. Just wing things, don't have that connection, just figure out as you go along, ask people when you're somewhere already, don't know everything in advance. So, but how can we do that now? Like it's hard to do that now that we have all of this connectivity.
I think the connectivity is misleading. I think that a lot of what's on the internet is inaccurate. I know that to be a fact because there are quotations by me on the internet of things I didn't say, or I didn't say it in exactly that way.
Right. Good example. Yeah.
I know that when I'm doing research, I wrote a book called The Tao of Travel, which I recommend to you. The Tao of Travel is an anthology. People used to say, "What's your favorite travel book?" And I say, "Well, I really don't have a favorite travel book. I have 300 books that I could mention to you, and 50 really core favorites." So I wrote or compiled an anthology of travel quotations and books to read, quotations from my work, from other people's work, and then topics like food in travel and how long did a travel stay where you say, there's one chapter about how long a traveler was in a particular place. For example, how long, D.H. Lawrence wrote a book called Sea in Sardinia. It's a 200-page book. How long was he in Sardinia? Well, he was there for 10 days.
Oh, right. Yeah.
How
It's
long
not enough,
was,
surely.
not enough. Well, but the book is not bad, but it's very impressionistic. But 10
Yeah.
days, including getting there. He went there from Sicily to Sardinia and back. So he spent about a week, actually, in Sardinia. How long was Kipling in Mandalay? You know, on the road to Mandalay from... well, he never went to Mandalay. How long was, I don't know, Mark Twain around the world? And how long was Graham Greene in Mexico? Turned out 6 weeks. So in researching this Tao of travel, I was constantly checking facts. And a lot of times the books that I read, the D.H. Lawrence book, the Graham Greene book, the Mark Twain book, Ibn Battuta traveled for 26 years. He traveled from Morocco to China to India to back. Didn't get to Australia, but he got to most other places. He traveled through the Muslim world. I kept running across, because I was actually borrowing books from the library and reading it. And then I would check with the internet. The internet often had inaccurate numbers, figures, places, quotations. And so I depended solely on the books that I was reading. So you say, how can you prepare? The best thing is first-hand experience. I wrote a book called Deep South. It's about, I took a road trip around the United States. And Deep South is about rural parts of the South. Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Arkansas, elsewhere. The country roads of the Deep South. And people constantly saying to me, well, did you go to Charleston? Hilton Head, that's really nice. But South Carolina is really wealthy. And I'd say, it's not wealthy at all. The places I was in the poorest county in the United States, practically, the third poorest, Allendale, South Carolina, and Allendale County, or in places where people were living in shacks, and and people were talking about, at the moment there's a big golf tournament on, the Augusta National. If you go to Augusta, you'd say, God, this is a lovely place. If you go outside Augusta, just Augusta, Georgia, which is happening right this minute, if you saw it on television, you'd say, God, what a lot of great golfers. It's so green. It's so lovely. A mile or two outside of Augusta is the Savannah River. There's an atomic energy plant that's polluting the river. There's a very, very poor community right next to it. And so you would have a very distorted notion. So if you look on the internet, Augusta, you'd say, God, that's a very salubrious place. But if you go there, get in your car and drive a little bit outside, you'll find very poor black communities that have nothing. They have nothing. They have leaky roofs. They've been overlooked, and that's what you write about. You instead of writing about what's on the internet and the popular event, the golf tournament, you look at everything else, the circumstances of a place. So it's not the destination. It's
everything almost.
It's the getting to the destination. So if you're going to Augusta, you're going through all this. So it's the journey, not the arrival, that matters. And that's really, really important. And I think that's what you don't get when you're doing research and so forth, or look for the internet, that it's the first hand. It's going there. In the South, I was driving, but I stopped my car. I talked to people, and I went to cattle shows, gun shows. I mean, you go the average gun show. And I don't know whether you have them in Australia, but
we don't have many guns here, so I guess there are gun shows, but it's Well, I've never been to one.
Well, it's an American tradition to own a gun for a lot of people. But a gun show is just everyone. You go into a hall. I had never had this experience. Although turns out we do have them in New England. They're not like the South, which is tables piled with guns and swords and military insignia and whatnot, and people dressed up in uniform. And you can actually go in a gun show in the South and say, "What's that?" And say, "Oh, this is a Luger. This is a 9mm German Luger. My uncle got it in Germany after the war. Is it for sale?" "Yeah." And then they'll say, "Well, if you've got the money," and you say, "It's a private sale." "Yeah." And so you give them the money and you walk away. Gee whiz!
Wow.
So, that was. The gun culture in the South is also big. The Confederate, the Civil War culture.
Right.
It's stuff that you read about, but when you're right there talking to people, and if you're writing a book, you need the human voice, and you need that. So I think you need to prepare yourself. You got to know where you're going and why you're there. I'll give you another example where the internet is somewhat useful, but can be misleading. So I wrote a book about Mexico. It came out last year. on the Plain of Snakes. Another road trip. I drove from here, where I am now. I'm in Sandwich, Massachusetts. I got my car and I drove to Texas. I drove to McAllen, Texas. I drove up and down the border. Then I drove into Mexico. But I knew that I was going to the southernmost province or state of Mexico, Chiapas. And to get there, I'd have to go through Juchitán. Juchitán is a town on the isthmus. And I thought I knew that they had an earthquake there. So I looked at Juchitán and the earthquake, and there was a mention of the earthquake. We talked about the earthquake, how many people died, and it was terrible. It had happened 6 months before I went there. Mm-hmm. And it said Juchitán is famous for its muxes. The word is Muxes, muxes.
Right.
Well, muxes are transsexuals. They're men. Well, they're women. It's kind of intermediate sex. They're not men, but they're not women either. But they're this transgender, I suppose, transgender. Mm-hmm. So maybe you'd say they're women or they would pass as women, but it's a whole culture of them. So it's not just a couple. There's mm-hmm. thousands. And it's famous. Now, I didn't know that until I looked at it on the internet. So I made a note of this, find out about the musha. So I went there and then met a couple of people. And I said, can you tell me about this? And they said, yeah, I'll introduce you to a guy who knows this. And because I had the clue on the internet about the mushas, mushas might be a corruption of the word mujer. Mujer.
Okay.
And because I had that, it's unique in Mexico, the culture. They occupy a place in the social structure. They're a protected group. Mm-hmm. And they have a festival every year called the Vela. So I found out about that. You know, you get clues from the internet, I suppose, and then you go to a place and expand that knowledge. But you can't depend on a book or the internet. If you're a traveler, I mean, the whole purpose of travel is to find out firsthand what's going on.
Yes, exactly.
And I think if you have that in mind, then you're not depending on the internet.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I like the idea that there are clues on the internet, and that's the kind of thing that I like to explore. And then you've got questions in mind that you can kind of find the right people to chat to, or you just are looking out for those kind of things. Then I want to go back to something you said. So I know you mentioned when you were in Malawi, you worked as a teacher, and I know I've read The Plain of Snakes, and you had a stint of teaching in Mexico as well. Yes. And I was teaching English in Japan and Slovakia and in Germany over the years, and I've long thought that it is one of the very best ways to get to know a country. It's sort of cheating in a way. You're almost not traveling. I mean, also I was getting paid, so that helps as well. But you have this like special opportunity to tap into local people and ask them nearly anything, because I was teaching a language, so, you know, there was an excuse to talk about all sorts of things, and people would want to tell me things. And I've often felt it's one of the best ways to travel or to get to know a country. I'd love to know what you think about that.
I completely agree with you. I couldn't agree more. I think that the most rewarding travel experience I had was as a teacher in Africa. I was a teacher in Africa for 6 years, 2 in Malawi, 4 in Uganda. Then I was a teacher in Singapore for 3 years. So there's 9 years of teaching. And then I've taught in other places. So I could probably say I spent 10 years of my life teaching, being a resident in a place. The other thing about so you're a teacher and you have students, so you're finding out what they care about. But the other thing, I discovered this, I don't know whether you noticed it in my Mexico book, that when you're a language student, you're constantly answering questions. So I had forgotten this, that language learning is all about interrogation. So someone says to you, what's your favorite sport? You say, my favorite sport? Well, football. Why do you like it? Well, I like it because on Sundays I watch television or I go to a game. And what do you like doing there? Well, I go and with my friends and you realize what's your favorite book? Well, my favorite, or your author, and my favorite. And you're talking about yourself or your family. And unless you're a liar, and you're revealing everything about yourself, what you like, what you don't like, the favorite food, where you like to go, where you've been, how you grew up, what your parents, and this interrogation in language learning is very helpful for the teacher, because the teacher then finding out, well, what do you like to do? Well, where do you go? What's your favorite proverb? What's your village like? What do you have a ritual that you're afraid of? Circumcision, or child marriage, or marrying your cousin, or whatever it is. So in Africa, if a woman's husband dies, she has to marry her brother. Well, in Malawi, this is the case,
Okay.
and
Yep.
in some other places, so she has to marry. She's compelled to marry her brother. In some cultures, this is the case. The uncle is a very important figure, and so the
Right.
woman, the widow, marries her brother-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
So occasionally people used to say to me, I don't want to do that. And I'd say, but this is interesting. And so it's a language class, but it's also an education for you as a teacher.
Absolutely.
And you're in touch with a group of people who are very impressionable too. And they want to know about you. So I agree with you. You were in Slovakia, you were in Germany, you were in Japan. You know much more about those places as a teacher than you would have if you were on a tour bus, just getting off and looking at the local church or the local museum. You're inside, you're actually talking to people. And the other thing that happens is you're invited to their houses.
Yes.
Something that rarely happens in travel. You meet people, you go to a restaurant, they talk, and then they go there. You go back to your hotel and they go back. But when you're a teacher, when you're there, they say, well, we have a birthday, can you come? And then you go and you bring a present or flowers, and then you sit, and there's a group of people and you're talking. Being invited into someone's house in a country is a great honor and a privilege, but it's also the most revealing thing that can happen. There are some cultures that don't entertain at home. The French don't entertain at home. I think when you were in Germany, you were probably very rarely in someone's home if you're a tourist. Maybe as a teacher you were, but
a little, but even then it's not so common. Yeah.
You don't get it. And I've often in Britain, this is the case. I mean, I lived in England for 17 years, and I rarely, except for a party, I was rarely invited into someone's house. I lived in a street, we had neighbours in South London. Now, 17 years. 17 years. I think there was only one house where I was invited in, and even then, it was very it wasn't grudging, but it was a very chilly experience. It wasn't a big warm come in like happens in other places.
Yeah.
Africa, India, I don't know, Southeast Asia, Mexico, where you're invited. Yes, come in.
Mm-hmm.
So France is notorious for, well, anyway, I don't know, maybe people live in a very tiny house, a very tiny flat, whatever it is, and you can't go in. But the idea is when you're a teacher, the likelihood of being invited in the house, that's where a culture thrives, in the house, not in a restaurant. I mean, you go to the restaurant, you eat the national food, you say, oh, this is great, this is wonderful, I love this. But to go into someone's house and in travel, one of the aims of travel, I suppose, is to find this intimacy or the domesticity in someone's house or hut. So in Africa, you might a mud hut, but someone could live in a very grand apartment in England or Italy or France, and you won't get there. So, I mean, that's one of the paradoxes, I suppose. But also, travel isn't just about exteriors; it's about penetrating, getting inside the culture. You get inside through the language. You get inside by negotiating, by making a friend, and then when you, I mean, the great privilege is get into someone's house. As I said, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen much. And I should say, in 1982, I had lived in Britain for 11 years, and I thought, I know nothing about this place. I've lived in South London for 11 years. And so I thought, I want to find out about living in Britain. So I wrote The Kingdom by the Sea. I decided to walk around the coast, take trains, take buses, but walk as much as possible around the English coast, and then the Scottish coast and the Irish Northern Ireland, and then down the other side. So, but at that time, this is 82, during the Falkland War, I stayed at bed and breakfasts. Now, a bed and breakfast, I discovered, is just someone's house.
Yes.
You pay £5, you go in, it says bed and breakfast vacancy, and you go up. I would get to a village or a town over there, and I'd look for a thing, vacancy, B&B. It's a bit like an Airbnb.
Exactly. Yeah, the precursor. Yeah.
I'd go in and I'd say, do you have a room? Yes. How much? £5, because that's what it cost them. Now it's much more. And I'd give them about £5, and they'd show you. You go through the person's house, and then just right this way, and you go through the living room, the parlor, the kitchen, then up the stairs to this little tiny bedroom. And they'd say, well, and very tiny, they said, well, share the bathroom. Okay. But you might say, well, that's horrible. Well, actually, the smaller and more intimate the house, the more you find out. Yeah. So then you say, well, do you have a TV? And they say, yeah, well, the Falklands War was on, so we're going to watch the news. So I'd go down into the parlor, living room, where the TV was, and we'd sit, have cups of tea, and watch the news about the Falkland War. So I was there, and then there'd be a table with an album on it, and I'd say, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's our wedding album. Do you want to see it? And then I'd look. So after the Falklands War, look at their wedding album. Oh, yeah.
It's the contrast.
Well, Reggie and I were in Mallorca, and here's Reg, and that's Reg with a funny hat, and you'd say, well, this is great. So when I wrote the book, this was a way of how you find out how English people live, was to go to a bed and breakfast, pay £5, and for the £5 admission was admission to the
to their lives,
of the life, the house, the wedding album, the kids, and that was my method.
That's a great method.
It worked. Yeah, it worked. Now, if you looked on the internet, so how much is a bed and breakfast in Ilfracombe or I don't know, Broadstairs, Margate? It's probably, I don't know what it would be, £50 maybe. Well, more anyway. Maybe 50. I don't know.
Yeah. But it's so worth it.
Seems to me, yeah, except they're probably wise to that now. They probably, but you'd be in the garage or something. But anyway, so that's this admission to the intimacy. So each time I've written a travel book, I've written 12 travel books. I've tried to figure out, how am I going to do this? How am I going to travel? How am I going to meet people? What language do I have to learn? How long do I have to be away from home? Is this one trip? Maybe a month here, 2 months over the course of a year or a year and a half, and I need to figure it out. In other words, it's not like Bruce Chapman wrote a book about Patagonia. So he went to Patagonia, he walked, he took buses, and then he came home. So he was there about 3 months in Patagonia. That's one way of doing it. And I've done that too. The Great Railway Bazaar, which you mentioned, I was away for 4.5 months. So I left, got homesick, kept traveling, got more homesick, kept traveling. But then finally I was detached. But it's too long. When I came back, my life was in ruins. I mean, my wife was angry. My kids barely recognized me. So that was bad. So I thought, I got to figure out how to do it so I'm not alienated from home.
Yes.
But all of these are decisions that the traveler makes, that the tourist or the holiday maker doesn't have to make. If you're going for a week to Japan or to Bali for a couple of weeks, that's fun.
It's not the same.
And it's pleasant. So there's no real challenge there. There are lots of people there who will welcome you. But traditionally, the traveler isn't welcomed. You show up and hope for the best.
Well, that's all for this week's episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. But next week in episode 215, I will play you the rest of my chat with Paul Theroux. Just quickly for the show notes for this episode, I'm going to list some of the books that we discussed, and that includes The Great Railway Bazaar, my favourite, The Tao of Travel, On the Plain of Snakes, which you might remember from the Thoughtful Travellers Book Club earlier this year, and The Kingdom by the Sea. Don't forget, of course, to come along and chat more about thoughtful travel in our Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group. You can find that just by searching for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook, or come and click the link in the show notes. And the show notes for this episode will be at notaballerina.com/214. So I hope you enjoyed this chat, and that was, remember, just the first half of my chat with Paul Theroux, and come along next week to hear the rest. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.